the lost origin of Einstein's relativity, and before that, negative math, how mathematical rules can be positively bent. He taught at Caltech before joining the University of Texas, and he's been a mainstay of our Jefferson Center courses. He offers a course on Einstein and the Nature of Conflicts, and biology, behavior, and injustice. And today he's going to speak to us about Einstein, relativity, and myths. Mr. Martinez.
My thanks to Tom and Mileva Maric for inviting me here today. I thank all of you for being with us. As Tom said, I'm going to be talking about Einstein, relativity, and myths. Something happens with certain figures in human history. For one reason or another, they become deified and their achievements become magnified. Einstein is, of course, one of those names. It's the reason why all of us are here. Interesting thing about some of those figures is that even though endless reams of paper and books have been written about them, we often find that what they have said is actually highly inaccurate. It encourages us to try to be a little more faithful to actually correctly representing the sources that are available, and it encourages also to think that we have something to contribute to understanding what is it that somebody of this magnitude, somebody of this profile actually did. So, as I have him here, a government bureaucrat in 1905 is the main person that we'll be looking at. But 10 years previously, this is what he looked like while he is essentially about to go back to high school after he has essentially dropped out for a year. And here he is actually having enrolled in Switzerland, having become a stateless citizen that for a year he didn't want to serve for the German military. He hated the fact that people would march in unison and uniform. Especially, he detested the idea of having to be recruited to kill on command in the name of your country. So he leaves Germany. He visits his family who happened to be living in Italy for a while, where they had an electrical firm, and then he moves to Switzerland where he finishes high school. I showed this photograph to some students yesterday, and I pointed out to them how strange it is. I mean, none of these guys are smiling or grinning or baring their teeth, and they're all mysteriously facing away. They're all casually not facing at the camera, and these are 17-year-olds. Some of them are 18-year-olds, so it's strange how very old they look. A couple of weirdos on the far left are actually looking at the camera, makes them look all that creepier. But as you can see, Einstein is not a particularly remarkable member of that group. He had tried to enter at the Swiss Federal Polytechnic in Zurich before attending this last year of high school. They had rejected him because some of his scores in the non-science, non-mathematics subjects were relatively low, but he gains admission in 1896 without having to take the entrance exam again. Here is Zurich, and here is the Swiss Federal Polytechnic, known in Europe as the ETH, essentially the MIT of Europe, the best educational institution for technology, engineering, and many other sciences. It was at the time, it still is. So Einstein's very privileged to be there. He doesn't make the best out of that opportunity, and along the way, he develops a friendship with this Serbian student, Mileva Maric, who also came into the university in 1896, 4 years older than him. She goes away at the end of the year, spends a year in a different city, then comes back. By the time she comes back, they become boyfriend and girlfriend. This is him in '98, standing in front of a photographer's screen. Looks like a guy on the make, but actually his performance at the university was not as stellar as it could have been because he spent a lot of time, let's say, reading extracurricular books, such as books on Maxwell's theory of electricity and magnetism, so he self-teaches himself the leading theory of the time on electricity and magnetism, because unfortunately it was not taught by the professors at the ETH, and he also spends a lot of time fraternizing with Mileva. Spends some time visiting his family in Italy. Their business gradually collapses, and essentially, after he graduates from the ETH in 1900, he finds to his disappointment that none of his physics professors will hire him. They don't want him as a graduate student, they don't want him as an assistant. He tries to get other appointments at other universities, he fails, so he does not become a graduate student anywhere. And since what he had was a bachelor's in science for teaching physics and mathematics, essentially high school students, the same track that his girlfriend was on, since that's what he has, he tries to get a job as a high school teacher. Again, fails miserably, nobody wants to hire him. Becomes a part-time tutor and finally moves to Bern, the capital of Switzerland, because he gets wind of the idea that a friend of his has a father who's going to provide for a job to be created for Einstein at the Swiss patent office, just because he has some knowledge of technical matters. So moves to Switzerland in 1902. Lives in poverty until he gets that job. As I said, his family's business is collapsing, and spends some of his time gradually working on physics, essentially as an amateur. This is what the Swiss capital looked like at the time. It still does. It's a beautiful place to visit. Very few trees in the city streets, but the streets are lined with these arcades. You can get from one side of the city to the other under the rain almost without getting wet. A window there, one of the two windows, either the one with the stripes or the one next to it, is where he first lived. He moves to a few apartments. This is the patent office where he finally gets his job. He puts an ad in a newspaper saying that he's a private teacher on mathematics and teachers, and that if you're a school student or whatnot, you can come take classes with him. And he meets a couple of people that way. By late 1902, Mileva Maric comes to Bern. She has visited a couple of times, but most of the time she's living separately. She spent some time in Zurich, had failed to get her bachelor's degree, had failed the final exams, stays to take the degrees again. It looks like there's a professor that will keep her as assistant. She thinks she might get a job at their library, but gradually her academic ambitions collapse when she fails her finals exam the second time around. At the moment, the stressful thing for her was that she happened to be pregnant. So she's pregnant by Einstein, and by 1902, January 1903, when she actually moves to Bern, Switzerland, she has somehow given up their daughter. We don't know what happened, but she has a baby daughter. Apparently Einstein never bothered to take a train trip to actually meet his daughter. The girl gets scarlet fever. We don't know if she died or if they gave her up for adoption. She literally disappears from the historical record. Einstein and Mileva moved to this street, one of the main streets in Bern, Kramgasse. You're walking from the tower towards this person on the left, and you keep walking and you look to your right, you'll eventually see this building, and the third floor of that middle building, the so-called second floor, is where Einstein and Mileva lived. You go up the stairs, you enter the doorway into the house, and there they are. By 1904, Einstein and Mileva have a second child, a boy, Hans Albert. They're very happy. He's elated that he can have another child and that they can all be together. These are relatively rare photographs. Here she is at what's called the Little Park in Bern by one of the famous bridges. And here they are, proudly showing off their baby again to the camera and smiling inside their house. Looking at these pictures, you can kind of sense that there is something relatively unremarkable about this existence. At the same time, at nights, he is working on physics at his home, sometimes while his wife is sleeping, or sometimes while other things are happening. And he keeps puzzling for years about a particular question that had occurred to him 10 years previously at around 1896, 1895. He has this puzzle about the motion of light. He's trying to understand something about the motion of light. What would light look like? What would light look like if I could travel next to it? If you have imagined a wave of light, what would light look like if I could actually look at it while I'm traveling next to it? That puzzle leads him to a series of conundrums having to do with experiments, having to do with the motion of light relative to moving bodies. In the thought experiment, he's moving relative to the light. How does light behave relative to moving bodies? He's working on this puzzle. It's a famous puzzle. Many physicists are working on it. They know it's seriously important for the future of physics. And he's frustrated. He can't get anywhere. 9, 10 years of working on this, he says he has no results. One day, he is so frustrated he can't take it anymore. He has nearly a nervous breakdown, stops working on it for a couple of months. Decides to work on it again, takes the whole puzzle to a friend of his, a co-worker, older friend called Mileva Maric, goes to Michele's house, and they talk about this. Every aspect of the problem, they analyze it. Suddenly that day, in conversation with Maric, Einstein has an idea. There's something strange about the idea of the velocity term. When we say the velocity, like in any of the many experiments that he was analyzing, how is that velocity actually being measured? How is that velocity actually being measured? To measure the velocity, you need to know a time. How is that time being measured? Where are the clocks? So he goes home frustrated from Maric's conversation, saying, it's no use, I've got to give it up, this is leading nowhere, and keeps working on the puzzle at night nevertheless. At night, in May 1905, Einstein realizes that there's something ambiguous about the concept of simultaneity of distant events. So, there's something strange about the velocity concept that leads you to the time concept, and that leads within time to a specific aspect of time, which is simultaneity. Simultaneity just means two events. How do I know these two snaps happen at the same time? That's the question. He realizes there's something really deep and profound about this idea, analyzes the concept of time overnight. Next morning, wakes up with the interesting idea that events that are simultaneous to one person, namely one observer, might not necessarily be simultaneous to another person. So if I say that these two events are simultaneous, somebody who's traveling on a train relative to me might say, no, they're not. And physically, we might both be right. Einstein develops this idea essentially from one day to another, although he says that it had been something that had been simmering in his mind, in the back of his mind, for years. Spends the next several weeks working on a paper, publishes it in volume 17 of the Annales de Physique, the main physics journal of the time. And this is the first page. This is how it's titled, On the Electrodynamics of Moving Bodies, a seemingly ordinary title for a paper at the time. He doesn't say anything such as on the new principles of physics, or Newton was wrong, nothing like that. Or a new theory of electricity and magnets, a new theory of motion. No, it's just another paper on the highly debated field of the electrodynamics of moving bodies. And this is who he was at that time. This photograph is from 1905, when Einstein is 26 years old. His son is 1 year old. There they are with Mileva. And at that time, he's a father of two. We don't know what happened to the first child. He had renounced his German citizenship. He had been rejected as exempt from military service in Switzerland because he had varicose veins and flat feet, sweaty flat feet. He had self-taught himself Maxwell's theory of electricity and magnetism, which shows that he's something of an amateur. He had been, in his words, rejected from every job in physics in Europe. He had submitted a PhD dissertation. It had been rejected, and he had to withdraw it. He had failed to become a high school teacher, and he was a government bureaucrat in a cheap suit, as he called himself, a federal ink shitter. So the interesting transformation is, how does this guy become this guy? This is 1938, 1946. Cosmoclast Einstein, all matter is speed and flame. Sometimes he's worth 8 cents, sometimes 15. Sometimes he's... So throughout the world, somehow he makes this spectacular impact. Rwanda, Congo, Portugal, the Netherlands. Time magazine in 1979 celebrated the 100th anniversary of his birth. There he is in 1979, again on cover of Time magazine. 1999, declared person of the century. At one point, while Einstein was alive visiting New York City, they took him to the Upper West Side to visit Riverside Church to show him the stone etching on the wall on the outside of the church, which amongst the many saints and Old Testament prophets included his own likeness. The only living person to have actually been immortalized, at least in stone, on the side of that church. To him, all of that is highly meaningless and arbitrary. If people are saying this about Einstein only some 100 years after his relativity paper, what will he be saying 500 years from now? So there is a phenomenal process of myth-making at stake here. It doesn't take an Einstein to see that our schools are failing our smartest kids. And 2007, the #1 New York Times bestseller, Einstein. So that to say that he becomes world famous is an understatement. How did this happen? While he is alive, he thinks this is some sort of a mass psychosis. There is something seriously wrong with the public at large, especially with Americans. There's something wrong. Americans are so bored that anything, random physicists from the old world, gets them all to run around and move. And he complains about this. He says, it strikes me as unfair, and even in bad taste, to select a few individuals for boundless admiration, attributing superhuman powers of mind and character to them. This has been my fate, and the contrast between the popular assessment of my powers and achievements and the reality is simply grotesque. You think this is a guy talking in 1955. No, it's in 1921, just 2 years after he has become world famous. Imagine if he can see all the action figures, cereal bowls, and stamps and stickers. So unfortunately, for famous people, the world seldom believes them. So naturally, most people think, oh, he's just being modest. He can't possibly be right. It can't be that we're all being deluded. So let's try to explain what happened. So in the effort to try to explain what happened, how the ordinary government bureaucrat became this world-famous personality, they turned back to the primary sources. Well, let's see the famous figure of 1905. Let's see what he actually did. Let's try to trace the origins of his success. When you look at the relativity paper of 1905, if you're a physicist or a mathematician, you can easily tell that the core of it is a series of 4, or we might say 5 equations, really 4 equations there at the bottom, which are known as the Lorentz transformation equations. These 4 equations have not been discovered by Einstein. Other people already knew or were beginning to know and publish about these equations before him, in various forms, in various halfway developments or versions of them. Einstein's one of the first people to put them in this particular form, but there's still a special case of a more general group of equations. But what matters is that if you want to understand where Einstein comes from, you look at relativity, you want to understand where relativity comes from, and you're a mathematically minded person, you get to those equations. Where did this come from? You're a physicist, you think, well, physics comes from experiments. You look at experiments, and the #1 experiment that resembles these equations is a famous experiment that was carried out in the United States of America in 1887 by 2 physicists, Albert A. Michelson and Morley. And what Michelson and Morley try to do in this experiment, that here, as you can see in this photograph, is in a basement, and it's a large stone slab floating on a pool of mercury, and what you're doing is you're shooting light in orthogonal perpendicular directions at the same time. The light bounces in these opposite directions, it comes back, you look at it. When light comes back together, all you see are some stripes. Okay, some stripes of interference fringes. What does that tell us? Absolutely nothing. But if you then take this experiment and you rotate it, then if one of the paths of light used to be in the direction that the planet is moving. Suppose that the planet is moving in that direction, and light is shot in that direction. And mathematically, since this light is going that way and that light is going perpendicularly, if you do the calculation, it should take slightly longer for light to go from here to there and back than from here to there and back, if the planet is moving in that direction. It should happen. Michelson-Morley were looking for that result. Had it happened, they would have been able to say, the planet is moving in that direction at that speed, and we found it out with an experiment in this space, but it doesn't work. It didn't happen. So they decide something is wrong. The most obvious, plausible consequence is that the Earth is not moving and that Copernicus is wrong. But that's too expensive. Physicists don't really often want to throw away 300 or 400 years of history and theorizing. So since that's too expensive, we're at the center of the universe, the Earth does not move, the sun goes around us, etc., etc. Ptolemy was right, since we don't want to go that far. We say, well, maybe something weird is happening, like maybe the object as you push it through space is somehow contracted. So the mirror is a little closer, and as it travels to a mirror, the mirror also travels, and it takes less time, so it equals out. And it's all conspiracy of nature. The Earth is moving, we just can't detect it. I'm not here to explain this experiment. You can find out this experiment online. The important thing is that this experiment mathematically leads you to the Lorentz transformations, the four equations that I showed you that are in Einstein's papers. So the natural inference from physicists about their boy Albert Einstein is that, of course, he got this from the Michelson-Morley experiment. By the 1960s and 70s, historian at Harvard University, Gerald Holton, shows convincingly that this did not happen. Einstein never emphasized the Michelson-Morley experiment. There is very little evidence that Einstein even knew about the Michelson-Morley experiment. Sometimes he contradicted himself about it, so it seems that he knew about it, but it didn't make any big difference, and he certainly did not mention it. In the 1905 paper, he even told someone later, had I known about it, I would have mentioned it. Had it come to my attention as something this closely related to it, I would have mentioned it in my paper. He doesn't. So, our expectations as physicists about experiments, theoretical physics must be based on experimental physics. The first approximation attempt is, well, Einstein's relativity came from Michelson-Morley experiment. It did not. Okay, we go looking for different explanations. So much for that myth. Gerald Holton successfully defeated. Now, well, we can say, well, we're interested in the cultural environment. Of course, we can be internalists. Just look at the papers and some equations and say, the equations must lead us to its roots. Other people will say, you've got to look at the context. It's not just a great work. There's something in the world that Einstein is living in. And where is he living? He's living in Bern. Is Bern just any old city? No. It's the Swiss capital. What's Switzerland? The clock-making capital of the world. And Einstein's paper is about the relativity of time. Look at the paper, and there it is. Near the top of that page, on the top, it says this. When I say, for example, this train arrived here at 7 on my clock, what I mean is that the pointing of the little hand in my clock and the arrival of the train are simultaneous events. He's trying to figure out, what do we mean when we use the concept of time in physics? What do we mean when we say the train arrived at 7? What does that mean? Isn't that a weird sentence? The train arrived at 7, huh? It arrived at 7. If I tell you the train arrived at 35, you'd be perplexed. What the hell is 35? The train arrived at 35:79. It's a weird concept that it arrived. What are we talking about? What I mean is that when the train arrived at the station, the needle on the pointers in my clock was pointing at this little number, and these two things are simultaneous events. So he's defining this, and then he starts talking about clocks and synchronizations. Trains, clocks, synchronization. And this is where he's living. You've got trolley cars, you've got trains, you've got clock towers that prominently display these massive clock faces. Clock-making and synchrony are not just incidental practices in Switzerland, they are a matter of cultural pride. National identity is a culture of technocratic precision. It leads Alan Lightman, a science writer, to write a novel, a little fictional book titled Einstein's Dreams, published in 1993, in which he argues, or he tells a story in which during the daytime, Einstein is having these conversations about physics and time with his friend Mileva, who is acknowledged in the Relativity paper, co-worker from the patent office, and at night, he's dreaming about the looming clock towers of Bern. Total fiction, wins a bunch of awards, sells a bunch of books, but he knows it's fiction. That's fine. You know, we can write fictional stories, but fiction leads us to myths. In 1905, the clock towers of Bern, in the very street he lived in, inspired Einstein to think of the relativity of time. That kind of claim begins to appear in historical works by top-notch historians of science. And I'm not talking, secondary writers. I'm talking the cream of the crop. Arthur I. Miller was a student of Gerald Holden's at Harvard, and he became a professor at University College London. He has come to our physics department to give talks. He's a great scholar. He has an interesting book on Einstein and Picasso, in which he argues that Einstein was influenced by the clock-making and synchrony culture of Switzerland into formulating the relativity of time. He says he had conversations about this topic with telegraphers. In 2003, Peter Gallison of Harvard University publishes Einstein's clock-splunkerous maps, again arguing in extensive detail how the Swiss clock-making technoculture inspired Einstein to his conceptual breakthrough. And it's a neat story. We want it to be true. It's a neat story because it shows us that theoretical physics, philosophical concepts can advance if they are well-grounded in technological and experimental procedures, which is the kind of thing, it's the kind of story we were trying to sell with the Michelson-Morley experiment. So it sounds well. So Gallison argues that while Einstein's working in the patent office, clockmakers, engineers, surveyors, astronomers, navigators, railroad officials, patent officers, and more were all concerned with the question of the synchronization of clocks. And Einstein is at the epicenter of those concerns. And he says, well, look, what is he analyzing? He's analyzing applications for patents. What kind of patents flew into the patent office? Patents for clocks and synchrony devices and pendulums and whatnot. He says Einstein at the patent office was just a few steps away from the train station. You can see it all coming together. When I analyzed this claim, trying to find its validity, I found that what's striking about this story is the idea that what we're trying to pinpoint is what is it that makes Einstein different from other ordinary mortals such as ourselves. You're a physicist, and you're working on quarks and leptons and God knows what. How come you're not having similar? Well, you're not at the patent office. Einstein was he was in a different context that enabled him to see things from the side, to have some sort of a mountain lab moment, and blink overnight come up with some breakthrough. It sounds right. The problem with it is if you look at what physicists were actually writing, you find that numerous other physicists who were not at the patent office wrote just like Einstein. Namely, they too mentioned trains and clocks and railway stations and synchronization. They mentioned that in their papers too. H.A. Lawrence, William Kingdon Clifford, Paul Appel, Edward Collignon. So I've looked at these, and so suddenly Einstein's text no longer seems that remarkable, just because he used the word clock and once mentions a train. Nevertheless, here's how Gallison argues. You walk around the city, you see these numerous clock towers. This is all in Bern, so footsteps away from one another. These people are obsessed with clocks. He gives you a map of what the electrical clock network looked like at around 1905, when Einstein's working at the patent office about to formulate the relativity theory. He says coordinated electrical clocks were a matter of practical import and cultural pride. By 1905, they're a prominent piece of the modern urban landscape throughout the city of Bern. His key point is that these clocks are not just in different places, they're electrically coordinated. There is a central clock that is sending an electrical signal to all of them so that they can be regulated and can remain in synchrony. But not all clocks in Bern or Switzerland are connected electrically. Here's the Swiss patent office. There's Einstein in his suit. And Gallison pinpoints a particular case of a neighboring town, a suburban annex of Muri, and old aristocratic annex where there's a particular clock tower that is not synchronized, that is not coordinated. I mean, it says the same time, but it's not electrically linked to the network. This is what he says. He says, time coordination patterns continue to pour into the office. Notice how it sounds like a story. He's a historian, but he's telling us a story. It could be a sentence straight from a novel. You almost see Einstein sitting at his desk, and people keep throwing papers at him, and it's just all these clock synchronization things. He can't take it. They're pouring into the office. On 25 April, for example, the office recorded the arrival of an application for electrographic controlled pendulum that would take a signal and bring a distant pendulum clock into a port. He tells you, they were just arriving, they were arriving in 1905, shortly before Einstein comes up with theory of relativity. All such inventions require documentation, including a model, specific drawings, and properly prepared descriptions and claims. Evaluating was painstaking and often lasted for months. The implication, of course, there is no such sentence, but the implication of Einstein himself is analyzing these things and working on it for months. The problem is there's not one shred of any evidence of any of the many boring things that Einstein analyzed at the patent office. He ever looked at clock synchronization procedure. And boy, they did receive a lot of patent applications for all kinds of things. And he's a third-class officer, which means he's the lowest of the low. Nevertheless, sometime in the middle of May 1905, he and his closest friend Michele Besso, I'm skipping something, it's irrelevant, but he and his closest friend Michele Besso had cornered the electromagnetism problem from every angle. Then, so that's the conversation I talked to you about. Einstein's talking to his friend. Then, Einstein recalled, suddenly understood where the key to the problem lay. He skipped his greetings the next day when he met Besso. Thank you, I've completely solved the problem. It's true. Einstein said this himself in a lecture in Japan in 1922. An analysis of the concept of time was my solution. Time cannot be absolutely defined, and there is an inseparable relation between time and signal velocity. His words. Now we have the interesting part, pointing up at a Bern clock tower, one of the famous synchronized clocks, and then to the one and only clock tower in nearby town of Muri. Einstein laid out for his friends the synchronization of clocks. So there you have the material culture, the geographic setting for the great ideas leading you to the breakthrough. The text is not as clearly visible in this one, but you can kind of see the city of Bern is roughly where those words are, and then you've got Wabern, and Muri in this map is on the upper left. Michele Besso, his friend, recalled that when Einstein excitedly told him of his realization that time had to be defined by signal exchange, he pointed to one clock tower in Bern and the other in Muri. And for you to do that, you've got to be at somewhere where they can be seen. So he says Einstein and Besso, therefore, must have been standing on that hill northeast of downtown Bern, because it's the only point from which both towers might have been visible. He must have been standing there, because that's the only point from which this could have happened. There's the hill. The problem with that hill is that it's not northeast of downtown Bern. It's south of Bern. The map is upside down. But nevertheless, so the event he is describing is physically impossible, because there exists no such hill. There exists no such hill northeast. But nevertheless, here's another image, so we can actually be there with them, holding hands with them while we point at clock towers. When Einstein gestured towards Muri's only clock tower, as he explained to Besso his new time coordination scheme, this is a structure to which he pointed. The problem is that Einstein never stood on any hill with Besso pointing at anything, because he has garbled an anecdote that has nothing to do with Einstein standing on the hills, and it has nothing to do with Michele Besso. It just didn't happen. Nevertheless, here is in the New York Times. In May 1905. Now notice the reality of the story. You have the New York Times, you have this fine newsprint texture on your fingertips that have filled you all up. In May 1905, on a hill from which he and his friend Michele Besso could see both the electrically synchronized clocks of Bern and the as-yet uncoordinated clock of the tower of suburban Muri, Einstein realized in a flash that, boom, the eureka moment has been created by Harvard historian of science. that lead him to this. So there you have MapQuest telling you where Muri is. It's southeast. There it is in Galson's map in the northeast, northwest, and the hill is in the south. Forgetting about the hill, what matters is the anecdote. Where's the anecdote come from? It comes from another co-worker that Einstein had, an older gentleman called Joseph Sauter. When the 50th anniversary of Einstein's 1905 paper is happening, Joseph Sauter gives a speech at Bern about what he knows and remembers about Einstein. He says that at one point Einstein gives him the paper, the manuscript he had just written on relativity. Joseph Sauter knew about electricity and magnetism, had published about Maxwell's theory, had published in the Annales de Physique, so he's a great colleague to look at this stuff. Joseph starts looking at it, and Einstein explains to him what he needs. What's crucial about that story by Joseph Sauter is that it is post factum. Einstein has already come up with a theory of relativity, he has already written a manuscript, and now it's show and tell. So what he tells Sauter, which is, let's suppose that one of the clocks is on top of a tower at Bern and the other in the tower of Muri, is something that happened after the fact. It's not something that was there at any eureka moment, and it's not something that involved his friend Michele Besso at all. Nevertheless, I pointed this out in print, nevertheless, the story did not go away, and I'm telling you, it never will. The point about myths is that they are tenacious fictions. You can say something and get it wrong and it can be fiction. But myths are tenacious and pervasive, and if you kind of scrunch it at one place, it will flower up in another. So the mistake does not end. Instead, it evolves, it becomes a myth. Before I move to what I was going to say, I tried to find, this is a great story. Some part of it should be true. So this is the best I could find. Alexander Moskowski, a guy who followed Einstein around in the 19teens before he was world famous, interviewed him, asked him a series of questions, and in that unauthorized book, in that book that caused Einstein a lot of problems, Moskowski presumably, plausibly, accurately recounts that Einstein acknowledged that there was a definite connection between his work at the patent office and the theoretical results which came out in his papers. So you're like, well, there it is. And they say, no, it's not. Because it doesn't say anything about clocks, nothing about trains, nothing about relativity, and nothing about simultaneity. It's too vague, too general. It could apply to any of the many papers Einstein worked on. So fine, you want to say that the patent office influenced him? Yes, it did. That's a true story. Einstein himself said that. The problem is you can't quite say that it led to the relativity of time. That was too good. That was a cartoon. Nevertheless, as I said, the myths do not die. Michio Kaku, professor of physics at the City University of New York, you've seen him on PBS, best-selling author of books that popularize science. Here is Kaku's account from 2005, the centennial year of Einstein and the clock tower. He says, Einstein remembered riding in a streetcar in Bern and looking back at the famous clock tower that dominated the city. He then imagined, what would happen if this streetcar raced away from that clock tower at the speed of light? He quickly realized that the clock would appear stopped since light could not catch up to the streetcar, but his own clocks in the streetcar would beat normally. He had finally tapped into God's thoughts. What's fascinating about that beautiful story is every word of it, not every word, every sentence is fiction. Fiction. There's no such recollection of Einstein on any trolley, looking at any clock tower, thinking about any of this, and thinking about God in that way in 1905. Total fiction. Lacking evidence to connect the birth of relativity to modern timing technologies, what writers have done is present their speculations as history. Above all, neither Einstein nor his colleagues wrote about any seminal connection ever whatsoever between his theory and any timing technologies. This would have been great. I mean, if only Einstein had said this. What kind of evidence, Mr. Martinez, are you looking for? If Einstein had said that, if he had just said that, I would say yes, it happened, but he didn't. Now, the interesting thing about that fake quotation is check out this one. Now, this is a different story, different myth. Einstein talking to his girlfriend in 1901. He literally says in his handwritten script, he says, how proud will I be when we both together have brought our work on the relative motion victoriously to its end. I mean, that's interesting. So, I mean, we have just defined the standard of credibility, and there we have apparently met it with the story that Einstein's wife was his secret co-worker. Thus, in 2003, PBS stations in the American and across the world, Australia, showed a documentary titled Einstein's Wife, The Life of Mileva-Einstein Marriage, in which they described the way in which Mileva Maric at the ETH in Zurich diligently worked on physics, while Einstein, of course, lazily smoked his crack with his feet on her face as she worked by hand. Of course, the sexist pig steals her work, her brilliant ideas, gives her no credit. Here she is on the left in 1899 with her friends. And there is the letter. So now you take somebody who worked on Einstein relativity in history. Yes, well, how do you explain this? I mean, how can you make fun of this when you have the literal proof by Einstein's hand that this actually happened? The problem is that Einstein worked on electrodynamics for 10 years before he formulated the theory of relativity in May and June of 1905. 10 years. He tried a number of different approaches. In 1901, he didn't have the theory of relativity. How can you say that he didn't have it when he just said relative motion in that letter? Because relative motion and theory of relativity are two different things. Many people in Europe for decades have been working on the so-called problem of relative motion. Einstein was one of them. The theory of relativity is one particular solution to the problem of relative motion. So unfortunately, although we want to make them to be the exact same thing, they're not. No, it can't be. It can't be. You're taking it away. Here is the website that used to accompany the TV show. Einstein's Wife. Did Mileva Maric collaborate with Einstein? You decide. Take the online poll. Some people go online, they vote, and 75% of viewers hereby decide the truth by sheer democratic will. Was it really possible for Albert alone? How can one man, one lowly bureaucrat with that pathetic little mustache make all those great discoveries? Fine, maybe he made 40% of them. But how can he do all of them? In the original manuscripts are ever found, the mystery might be solved because, of course, they're handwritten in the latest handwriting, they got her signature all over. In 1955, a Soviet physicist, now dead, claimed that he personally saw the original manuscripts and that Mileva's name appeared as co-author. Fact or fiction? Well, it seems to be a fact, and then you decide. And she comes out winning. So you have all these people. 1969, Abraham Yoffe, in his article about Einstein, pointed out the papers were signed Einstein Maric. Evan Harris Walker, in the letter to Physics Today, their author was Einstein Maric. He says that Yoffe said that. Michel Sackheim, author of Einstein's daughter, they were signed Einstein Maric. PBS shows the author was Einstein Maric. Marriage is just a different way of spelling marriage. What did Yoffe actually write? In 1955, the text that they are all referring to, translated into English without transposing any of the words from the order in which they have in Russian. In the year 1905, in Annals of Physics, there appeared 3 articles. Those were the theory of Brownian motion, photon theory of light, and the theory of relativity. Their author seems to be in the singular. Unknown until that time, a bureaucrat at the patent office seems to refer to Einstein. Einstein Maric. Maric was the last name of his wife, which by Swiss custom is added to the husband's last name. It was in fact a practice. Some people did sometimes use the alliance now, connect the 2 names together, and thus grows this story. But notice, if you look at it, it doesn't even say anything about the signature. Yet the urge to misread and to pay more attention to the blank spaces between the lines of ink leads many people to this day to literally see that and see that he is saying it. He is sending it to us in a coded message that he himself saw those manuscripts, total fiction. Yoffe does not say he saw any manuscripts, and that what they said was Mileva Maric or the Einstein Maric, total fiction. It's just not saying, it's just not there. Here he is with some friends. They had a discussion group. And one of them, the guy at the center, Maric, Romanian, the PBS show in 2003 tells us, Solovin writes, Solovin, Einstein's close friend, he wrote this. Quotation mark, Mileva would sit in the corner during our meetings listening attentively. She occasionally joined in. I found her reserved but intelligent. Clearly more interested in physics than in housework. I mean, if ever there were a sentence that has the ring of truth, it's that. And of course, she's not a moron. She went to college, studied physics. Of course she's more interested in physics than housework. So it must be true. We want it to be true. Unfortunately, if you look at that nasty little number there, that 2003, it might lead you to look for earlier sources. So you go to 2000, Dennis Over by Einstein Laws and a Novelistic Biography, says Maric had made her a de facto member of the discussion group. Solovin remembered her sitting quietly in the corner during the meetings, following their arguments but rarely contributing. He found the reserved or intelligent clearly more interested in physics than hardware. You compare the two. At top it says she occasionally joined in. Here it says rarely. And it really looks as though the one on the top is derived from the one at the bottom. In fact, it is. If you care about Solovin himself, you can find his own writings in 1956. This is what he actually says. Intelligent and reserved, listen to us attentively, but never nothing about housework, nothing about how interested she was in physics, nothing about how she sometimes added a sentence or corrected a paragraph, nothing. Well, that's just the published version. Somebody must have tampered with it. In an unpublished manuscript letter to Einstein's biographer, Solovin writes, she never took part in our discussions. We did not think about people having her. Well, Solovin must be part of the secret Einstein alliance, be a close friend of Einstein. He must secretly despise Mileva Maric, he was fastidious, and he must have somehow been part of this conspiracy to either, unfortunately, Solovin was one of the few friends of Einstein who actually did find his way into Mileva's heart. So they were good friends, and he helped her and had a positive relationship for many, many years. So again, but the story is just good. You just can't let it die. There they are with Hans Albert in 1905. What about her? Why don't we let her speak? Why don't we listen to Mileva? Where is Mileva, Dr. Martinez, in your talk? I see a lot of other people. What about her? Her voice? Could she not write? She writes to her intimate close friend in 1906, a year after Einstein has written the relativity paper, or less, just a few months. She says, my husband spends all of his free time at home, often playing with the boy, but I would like to remark that this, together with his official boy, is not the only work he does. He is writing a great number of scientific papers. It sounds like she is saying that he is writing the papers. But if you are suspicious, as you should be, there is something disturbing about that quotation, which is that number 1991. What is that? Well, this is a translator. He has translated that. What is that ellipsis? Did she not write something, or are there words that have been omitted? But he is busy stealing my work. A very accurate translation from the original German, the letters in German. I've read it, I've translated. Translation of Milan Popovic, my husband spends all of his time. The words that George Kirstich wrote, Serbian biographer of Mileva Maric, Serbian, the ones he deleted were, but to give him his due. He deleted those words. He thought it was necessary to delete that one little phrase. To give him the credit that it's probably is. I have to mention that he's also writing she also writes to her friend that Einstein's papers are piling high, and she's very proud of him, and so on and so forth. Nevertheless, in Serbia by now she's a national hero. There are scholarships in her name. There are busts where people have T-shirts and banners of Mileva Maric, and it will never go away. It will never go away, and it's nice. I don't mind. Hopefully she did something. I want her to be the co-author. I want her to be the co-author. Here she is in a TV movie in 2008, sitting on Einstein on the bench. I see she's so usually often in public. This is how he got some of his best work done. Never mind. colleague Michele right there for having stood by him and giving him several worthwhile suggestions. He actually acknowledges someone. Nobody cares about this. Nobody wants to make a conspiracy theory about how it was led. The theory is just not that interesting. Who cares? Short guy with you. Anyhow, moving on. Next myth. I still haven't talked about the important stuff, but moving on to next myth. There are certain experiments that were very influential to Einstein. If it was not the Michelson-Morley experiment, one experiment that really influenced him a lot was the aberration of starlight. As the telescope moves, you need to tilt it in an unusual way in order to keep focus on a distant star. If you fill up the telescope with water, it behaves in an unusual way. Einstein is very concerned about that experiment. If you have some pipes full of water and you shoot light through those pipes and then you move the water, the light behaves in a weird way. Einstein was extremely concerned about these experiments about light in moving water. Therefore, at around 2005, Professor John Norton, a top-notch historian, philosopher of physics at Pittsburgh University, one of the leading programs in the nation, he argues, again, that what happened, the way Einstein got the relativity of simultaneity, the idea of the relativity of time, is that from these experiments, he was able to infer what is known as Lorenz's local time. The idea that one time coordinate in one reference system, us, is different from the time in a different reference system, the moving water. So John Norton says that Einstein, in a way, induced, this is induction. He derived the theory of relativity from experience, from a series of experiments that were available at the time. The problem with that theory, that argument, again, is that unfortunately Einstein never said that. He never said that. For 50 years, friends, reporters, psychologists, historians, heads of state, neighbors, random people off the street are asking Einstein, how did you do it? And he never said, well, I induced the concept of relative time from the experiments of moving water and light. He never said that. Well, what did he actually say? Well, in the book of 1917, he explains that the book is written on the whole in the sequence and connection in which the events actually happen. It's a book in which, for example, you will find no mention of the Michelson-Morley experiment, but you will find mention about experiments with light and moving water. So in that book, he explains, as I've illustrated here, that if you are the guy standing in the center of the railroad tracks and two lightning bolts strike, you will be very inclined to think that they are simultaneous if you see them both at the same time. If you see light from there and light from there at the same distance reaching you at the same time, maybe if you've got eyes on the sides of your head or you got a mirror, if you see these, then you say they are simultaneous. It sounds like a good definition of simultaneity. The problem is that the guy on the train, a second guy, also can see both flashes of lightning, and he will disagree. He will say that if the train is moving that direction, he says that lightning from lightning B actually struck first. So we say, well, the guy on the train is wrong, clearly because he's moving. And the guy says, I wasn't moving, I was sitting, and I was drinking my coffee and reading. You were moving, I saw you sitting by the window. And we stop at him and say, you moron, the train has an engine, the train was going somewhere, you had luggage, you know you were moving, cheater. And then he says, the planet's moving. Don't you believe in Copernicus? He's like, uh-oh. You're right, we kind of were moving. Who was moving less? Well, the planet's moving, the trains were right. Doesn't work that way in physics. The size of the reference system doesn't matter. So Einstein explains in 1917 that this chain of thinking leads us to the idea of the relativity of time. He says this, oh, that can't be true. Never trust the author. Authors are liars. Are you so dumb as to believe the printed word? Boy, what is wrong with you? What century were you born in? Don't you know about Paul Ricoeur and the hermeneutics of suspicion? And don't you know about reader response criticism? Don't you know about anything? The author is always a liar. You learn more from the text by what it hides. In 1916, a psychologist analyzing scientific creativity interviews Einstein at length in interviews that are published in 1945, Max Wertheimer. He asked Einstein, how did you do it? Einstein says, I already explained how I did it, it's in my book. And then Wertheimer explains in detail this. He said, how lucky we are that for this major scientific event, Einstein has an published explanation of how he did it. So there he is with his buddies, and what did they read? If we were to ask Einstein, how did you do it? It turns out that in several places, Einstein says that one of the decisive texts that influenced him into the kind of thinking that led him to the theory of relativity of 1905 was David Hume's treatise on human nature. So, the weird thing is that what he's saying in the book is that he got this from a thought experiment about a moving train. What he says in letters is that he was influenced deeply by reading philosophy. Not even kind of new philosophy, but old-fashioned 18th century Scottish philosophy. Boy, don't you know about Kant's critique to Hume? Yes! Kant was thoroughly read by Einstein when he was a teenager. Everybody would go get drunk and he would say, beer makes you dumb and lazy. Instead, he would read Kant. And he said he would get drunk on reading Kant. And only years later did he read Hume. And he said Hume is much more precise and sharper, clearer thinker than Kant, who had written his stuff and replied to Hume. In 1915, Einstein writes to physicist philosopher Moritz Schlick, German, founder of the Vienna Circle, positivist. He tells Schlick, 1915, your exposition is also quite right, that positivism suggested relativity theory without requiring it. Also, you have correctly seen that this line of thought was of great influence on my efforts, and indeed, Ernst Mach, and still much more Hume, whose treatise on understanding, he garbles the name. We know it was the treatise on human nature, not the longer version. I studied with eagerness and admiration shortly before finding the relativity theory. I knew exactly when he read it, but it's literally weeks before. Very possibly, Einstein says, I would not have come to the solution without those philosophical studies. He has a perfect chance to give Moritz Schlick a smackdown and say, no, positivism has nothing to do with relativity. Actually, I got it from my wife, the Swiss Patent Office, and the Michelson-Morley experiment. He does it. He says, you're right. In 1947, Mileva Maric, Einstein's friend who is acknowledged in the relativity paper, 1947 writes to Einstein and says, you know, I've been thinking about this. Isn't it possible that my having given you Ernst Mach's writings, Ernst Mach was a physicist who was deeply interested in psychology and perception and who is often misrepresented as a philosopher. This physicist, is it possible that my giving you his books, such as The Science of Mechanics and The Analysis of Sensations, that led you to thinking about rulers and clocks and measurements? Einstein says no. He replies in 1947, he says, yeah, I acknowledge that Mach influenced me. He has forgotten by 1947 that he did influence him, because in the intervening decades, Einstein has become so critical of Mach that he doesn't realize the immense, extraordinary intellectual debt that he has to Mach, which he still remembered in 1915, and which many other people remember that Einstein had. He has effaced that and says, no, it wasn't Mach, it was David Hume. David Hume, who I read with my friend Solovin and Havish in Bern. And we have other pieces of evidence, but again, our choice is, are we going to believe this guy, or are we just going to read between the lines? So, trying to wrap up, Ernst Mach, in the 1880s, 1890s, and onwards, even after Einstein becomes famous, they even get to correspond, he argues that physics should be based on sensations. It's kind of our intuitive feeling that physics must be based on experiments. He says it has to be based on sensations. He thinks, by doing this, we may be able to fix the division, the split between physics and psychology. Because then Mach thinks the fundamental elements of physics are what we see. So this is Mach's nose. As you can see it, here's a picture of him. You see that nice, sharp, sloping nose and that mustache? There's the mustache peering in. And he's saying, there's a certain kind of truth to this. There's a certain truthiness that should be the foundational aspect on which physics is built. Physics should not be built on invisible atoms. What's much more real are perceptions, sensations. The only reason we can give meaning to the concept of simultaneity, two things happening at distant places at the same time, is if we have some way to perceive it, some way to measure it, some way to see it. If we cannot somehow measure it and detect it in an experimentally verifiable, repeatable way, then that concept has no place in physics. That's the kind of thing that Mach is saying. It's the kind of thing that the positivists were saying. This approach, sometimes called positivism, sometimes called operationalism, having to do with operations and observers and experiments, is in a way what is called a criterion of meaninglessness. If a theoretical claim cannot be converted into experimental procedures, then it is meaningless. It has no place in physics. And that is what Einstein thinks he's doing with Newton's notion of time. Newton thinks there's this universal absolute time that sees everything and is independent of everything. Einstein thinks, well, unless you can somehow instantiate that concept, it is useless. So he wipes it away. The ether is this invisible fluid that is all around us. Einstein says, unless you can empirically demonstrate that object, that concept, such as our motion relative to the invisible ether, then it's useless. Atoms. Unless you can somehow detect them, Einstein comes up with a way to detect atoms. He says, okay, atoms are atoms are so it's a criterion of meaninglessness or meaningfulness. It becomes extraordinarily influential amongst physicists. American physicist P.W. Bridgman argued that Einstein's best illustration of positivistic thinking is the definition of simultaneity. And the idea that magnitudes only have meaning if they can be defined in terms of operations, physical operations. Of course, we all know that's bad. Positivism has been laughed out of the academy in its many versions. People don't like that word, but that's what's here. When you go back into history, you actually find uncomfortable words showing up in the text. So many people say, it's positivism. What is that? Positivism. That sounds so positive. But everybody talks about it as though it's a bad word. As I mentioned, there is this element in Einstein's paper. He says, well, what do we mean by the concept of Zeit, time? What do we mean by time? He says, well, this clock here, time is the reading on this clock and so forth, synchronization. That thing has been thoroughly attacked as a valid mode for science. And one of the key figures and now I'm finally ending, in the philosophy of science and philosophy of physics that at the international level succeeded in assaulting that kind of operationalism and positivism and this way of these criteria of meaning was Karl Popper. Rejects positivism, operationalism, and he says that what should define science instead is falsifiability. A claim is scientific if you tell me in what way we can falsify it. If I tell you there's 17 green goblins behind this desk and every time you go around it, they run around so you can never see them, then we say, well, that's just nonsense. But if I tell you that there's a species of damselfly that lives in a particular swamp in Texas and it has a particular shape, and you can go see it, and I've got several of them, you say, well, that sounds right. That sounds right. Let's give you a book award. And that's science, one of our this year's winners in the Hamilton Book Awards, which I did not get. The lead was a book about species of damselflies. They're doing science, I don't know what I'm doing. I do a survey with students. I have them rank which one of these fields is scientific and what's a science and what's not a science. Biology, archaeology, physics, architecture, sculpture, history, literature, poetry. Almost always, the one that gets the lowest ranking as a science is history. Nevertheless, Popper, when he's a young guy, as you see him here, as we barely remember him anymore, he saw Einstein as a young man when Einstein lectured in Vienna. At the time, Popper had no theory of falsification or falsifiability in science. He goes to this lecture and walks away in a daze. He says, I can't even understand or remember what Einstein said. He knew German, he just couldn't. He just don't remember. But he walked away with a profound change in the way he saw science. He thought, what Einstein has done differently than other physicists is he has formulated a theory without waiting for new experiences. So it's not that Einstein formulated a theory of relativity or the theory of gravity on the basis of new experiments. No. The experiments Einstein knew about were old. That experiment about water from 1850, a whole 55 years before Einstein. The theory of gravity, when he's talking about orbits of planets around the sun, and when he's talking about the deflection of starlight, it's not that he was inventing a theory to explain some phenomena that had just recently been discovered. It wasn't induction. It wasn't induction. That's not what he was doing. So Popper is very impressed that what Einstein's doing is deeply scientific, and he formulates his new theory of what is it that's at the heart of science. And my argument here today, what's interesting, what I'm giving you in this talk, which is new, I've rehashed a bunch of things I've talked at other talks. What's new is that he got that from Einstein. That's what's interesting. In 1919, Albert Einstein published an article in a newspaper in which he expressed that he was intensely interested in experiments, he was confident in his theories, he regarded his theories with more skepticism than other physicists, but the key thing I'm saying about that particular article is that Einstein denied scientific induction, which is what Hume is doing, which is the reason that Hume was so profoundly influential in Einstein, because Einstein thinks that the principles of physics, the so-called laws of physics, are not absolute, true, and universal. They are essentially fictions. He says in the article, the truth of a theory can never be proven. So whereas people before Popper and Einstein, many had thought that what distinguishes science is proof. What distinguishes science is proof, it's confirmation, it's verifiability. Einstein says that's not it. The theory can never be proven. He advocates the so-called hypothetical deductive approach to science plus falsification. That you test these theories and you try to falsify. And that's what he's doing much of his life. Popper writes about 1919. What impressed me most was Einstein's own clear statement that he would regard his theory as untenable if it should fail in certain tests. For example, if the redshift of spectral lines due to the gravitational potential should not exist, then the general theory of relativity, the theory of gravity, will be untenable. That's what Einstein says. So there are certain things, if you detect, if you do not detect a particular redshift of spectral lines, then my theory is wrong. He says that before those measurements have been made. Here was an attitude, says Popper, utterly different from the dogmatic attitude of Marx, Freud, Adler, and others, especially their followers. Einstein was looking for crucial experiments whose agreements with his predictions would by no means establish his theory, while a disagreement, as he was the first to stress, would show his theory to be untenable. This, I felt, was the true scientific attitude. It was utterly different from the dogmatic attitude which constantly claimed to find verifications for its favorite theories. Thus, I arrived by the end of 1919 at the conclusion that the scientific attitude was the critical attitude, which did not look for verifications but for crucial tests, tests which could refute the theory but never prove it. Popper, like Einstein, argued that Hume was right, that induction was a myth. He argued, like Einstein, that scientific theories are always conjectures, hypotheses, when they are considered logically. And of course, Popper is aware that there is this major movement called positivism. He knows of Maurice Schlick, he knows of Carnap, he knows of Wittgenstein, he knows of the Vienna Circle. He's annoyed or peeved that they've never invited him to be a part of it. But he thinks that what they are doing is nonsense, because by their criteria of meaningfulness or meaninglessness, they have said, look, whatever cannot be translated into physical operations is meaningless. It's metaphysics. Metaphysics is meaningless. It's gibberish. The problem, for example, is if the positivists are saying that that a theory is meaningless because it can't be proven, how can they even try to prove it if they don't understand it? And if you need to understand it in order to prove it, then it must be meaningful. How can you understand something that's meaningful in order to prove it? So there are certain logical problems there that Popper harps on. And regardless, operationalism, positivism becomes an integral part of much of successful physics. Heisenberg follows Einstein. He says, well, Einstein says that if simultaneity cannot be measured, then it doesn't exist. And I can't measure both the position and the momentum at the same time of an electron. Therefore, electrons do not have both position and momentum at the same time. These things do not exist. He is following what Einstein has done. Einstein thinks Heisenberg is crazy. How can you seriously say this? And when a friend of Einstein's finally finishing, Philip Frank tells Einstein, he says, Einstein is complaining about Bohr, and Heisenberg says, a new fashion has now arisen in physics by means of ingeniously formulated theoretical experiments. It is proved that certain physical magnitudes cannot be measured, such as position and momentum at the same time. From this, the conclusion is drawn, says Einstein, that it is completely meaningless to retain these magnitudes in the language of physics. Let's get rid of them. To speak about them is pure metaphysics. Einstein is complaining about this. Philip Frank says, but the fashion you speak of was invented by you in 1905. Einstein says, a good joke should not be repeated too often. And I'll leave it at that.